Hey everybody, this is the second video of part 5 of chapter 2 of part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, third period 1930 to 1941, part 1, The Dominated. Part 2 of the book is titled The Militarized Working Class, and Chapter 2 of the book of that part is titled Extension of the Wage-Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. And the section is titled The Circumstances of the Workers' Defeat in the 1930s. Alright, so here we go. This is the second video of this chapter. New section, Section E. The reproduction on a larger scale of differences between skilled and unskilled workers. In Part 1 of Volume 2 of Capital, Marx devotes a chapter to mechanization and large-scale industry. I think that might be backwards, or maybe he's referencing a French edition, but that's definitely not I don't remember that being the first part of Volume 2. And the footnote says the footnote says Capital Volume 1. So, let's see what is said. Marx observes that in the capitalist use of the machine, it is the whole system of machines that he terms the, quote, automation, end quote. Not automation, quote, the automaton, end quote, which is the subject, while the workers are simply auxiliary conscious organs helping its unconscious organs, and like them, subordinated to the central motive power. To this relationship of workers with the machine, which signifies the subordination of live labor to dead labor, Marx opposes that in which the collective worker or the body of social labor appears as the dominant subject, and the mechanical automaton as its object. Well, let me repeat that sentence. To this relationship of workers with the machine, which signifies the subordination of live labor to dead labor, Marx supposes that in which the collective worker or the body of social labor appears as the dominant subject, and the mechanical automation as its object. Marx remarks that the capitalist use of the machine transforms the forms of division of labor among the workers. The capitalist use of the machine brings about a new relationship between the main worker and his assistants. It divides workers into those who work with mechanical tools and the laborers. It engenders more qualified personnel, engineers, mechanics, joiners, etc., who supervise the general mechanism and make the necessary repairs. Marx also observes that the bourgeoisie creates for its children polytechnic schools, while the bourgeoisie reserves for the proletariat only the shadow of vocational training. Thus Marx thinks that with the conquest of power by the working class, there will be introduced the teaching of technology, practical and theoretical, in the people's schools, a teaching needed to break up the accumulation of knowledge technical, and scientific at one pole of society, which serves the interest of capital and reduces the direct producers to servitude. I'm going to repeat that sentence because there's a lot of italics in it. Thus, Marx thinks that with the conquest of power by the working class, there will be introduced the teaching of technology, practical and theoretical, in the people's schools, a teaching needed to break up the accumulation of knowledge, technical and scientific, at one pole of society, which serves the interest of capital and reduces the direct producers to servitude. The character of the capitalist revolution of October did not prevent, in its aftermath, attempts being made to struggle against the capitalist characteristics of the educational system. The Bolshevik Party, in fact, wanted to be the instrument of a proletarian revolution, and was therefore led to create, quote, the unique school of work, end quote, and the, quote, workers' faculties, end quote. Similarly, it decided on the creation of factory trade schools. Wikipedia says a Rabfak was a type of educational institution in the Soviet Union which prepared Soviet workers and peasants to enter institutions of higher education. Such institutions were present in every faculty and institute for higher learning, and tended to contain a density of members of either the Komsomol or the VKPB, which is the Communist Party. The Rabfaki were created by Mikhail Pokrovsky in March 1919 and were active until the 1940s. The Rabfaki were intended for adults who had received little formal schooling and were intended as a fulfillment of the promises of the revolution for upward social mobility for workers and peasants. Back to the text. Similarly, decide on the creation of factory trade schools. However, the combination of the concrete conditions, disorganization of industry, resistance to the teachings handed down by the old regime, illiteracy, etc., and the logic of a capitalist development of productive forces, which the Bolshevik Party did not get to grips with, soon limited, and increasingly so, the scope of decisions taken in the morrow of October. For example, the Rabfaks, which were simultaneously to contribute to political education and teach a variety of industrial techniques, tended little by little towards the training of specialists, who constituted a sort of, quote, worker elite and engineers of proletarian origin. Throughout the 1920s, two tendencies were still in confrontation. One of them emphasized mass polytechnic training and a single-stream approach, parenthesis. This tendency was often to be found within the Komsomol, in parenthesis. The other insisted on rapid specialization and the setting up of distinct training streams. Footnote. Various aspects of this struggle are noted in Volume 2 of the present work. End footnote. This second tendency was supported by enterprise managers and certain trade unionists. At the end of NEP, when the capitalist revolution was deepening, the secondary tendency was more and more strengthened. Priority was given to the training of narrowly specialized workers. The conceptions of the Central Institute of Labor thus prevailed, both in the organs of accelerated professional training connected with this institute and in the trade schools, henceforth authorized to provide a rapid, quote, training, end quote, of a limited 6-month term. This training was distinct from that given in the course of the, quote, normal, end quote, previous 2 or 3 year cycle. Training on the job then became very important. Partisans of this orientation invoke, in justification, its cheaper, quote, cost and greater, quote, profitability, end quote. And these partisans of this orientation were believed. Thus, there was consolidated division between two training systems. One training system, quote, produced, end quote, workers who were narrowly specialized and subject to the short-term demands of production. The other trained a, quote, worker elite, end quote, destined to enjoy much higher wages than those of the mass of the workers. Dual streaming contributed to the development of a, quote, qualification, end quote, polarization. The, quote, short stream, end quote, insisted on, quote, drills, end quote, necessary for very specialized activity. It was a matter of adapting future workers to work that was parceled into small blocks. Apprentices were shown how to do physical exercises. Formerly, this stream also included scientific and technical instruction, leading to a so-called, quote, technical minimum, end quote, diploma. But the content of this instruction was increasingly specialized. Thus, the decree of September 15, 1933, reduced to 6 months the duration of courses in the factory schools and theoretical instruction to 20%. In addition, the latter had to be directly relevant to specialization. The theoretical instruction had to be directly relevant to specialization. In these circumstances, only specialized workers could be trained, not skilled workers, and there could no longer be any question of a polytechnic training. The latter henceforth was criticized for producing, quote, intellectuals rather than manual workers, end quote. Its contents reduced the, quote, technical minimum, end quote, to no longer prepared the way for entry into another training system. During the first 5-year plan, the trade schools of 2 or 3 years still trained a large number of skilled workers, mainly recruited from old workers and the sons of skilled workers. Later skilled workers were increasingly trained in technical schools, which drew their pupils from secondary and primary education. Footnote: these schools trained 450,000 workers in this period. See A. Baykov's book, The Development of the Soviet Economic System, published in 1947, page 217, in bracket, which, however, represents only about the 450,000 workers in this period, represents only about 18% of the increase in worker numbers in main industry. Some of the workers who graduated from these schools, moreover, went through a shortened course, which did not give them a general view of the production process of which they were a part. End footnote. Later, skilled workers were increasingly trained in technical schools, which drew their pupils from secondary and primary education. The same thing happened with the engineers' schools and the institutes of higher education, which especially flourished. Footnote: the number of specialists trained by the universities grew from 170,000 during the first 5-year plan to 369,000 during the second 5-year plan. Specialists trained by technical schools and special secondary schools grew from 291,000 to 623,000. The common characteristic of this training was that it was cut off from production. The instruction given was predominantly theoretical. However, this instruction was also very specialized. There was therefore a departure from polytechnical forms. End footnote. Henceforth, the principle of a single stream was abandoned. The separation between the training and situation of skilled workers on the one hand and the mass of workers on the other became ever greater. At the end of the 1930s, the division of the working class was consolidated. The bulk of the industrial working personnel consisted of laborers and specialized workers who had received a really minimal training. The bulk of the industrial working personnel consisted of laborers and specialized workers who had received a really minimal training. A minority consisted of skilled workers whose living conditions differed greatly from those of the mass of workers. Movement from one category to the other was increasingly difficult despite the existence of a network of relatively large evening schools. In effect, the recruitment of skilled workers was mainly from the secondary schools. As well, the living and working conditions of the mass of workers constituted important obstacles to sustained and successful participation in the evening schools. Consequently, the polarization of the working class was consolidated. New section, Section F, Forms of Worker Consciousness. Obviously, an analysis of the forms of workers' consciousness would be very important for grasping certain of the ideological effects of the offensives and defeats suffered by the workers, of the destruction of all organizations they could call their own. However, a true analysis of these forms of consciousness is for many reasons extremely difficult, perhaps even impossible. In fact, the possibility left to the workers to express themselves and even to act outside the control of the authorities was reduced to a minimum by a brutal repression based on the near omnipresence of the police. Footnote, we deal with the mass repression and its, quote, contribution, end quote, to the development of penal labor in Part 3 of this book. Here it will only be added what this did to reduce the workers to silence. It provided both repression and enormous extension of police activity characteristic of the 1930s. In the second half of the 1930s, there existed in each factory above a certain size a, quote, special section, end quote, of the NKVD charged with checking the activity of the enterprise management and with using a network of informers to maintain a dossier on each worker. See M. Feinsad's article, Controls and Tensions in the Soviet System, published in American Political Science Review, June 1950. End footnote. On the other hand, the very conditions under which workers lived and the diversity of their thought, their origins, the conflicting relationships they had with official ideology, parenthesis, which did not succeed in functioning as a true dominant ideology, end parenthesis, contributed to a real explosion of the forms of consciousness while hindering a clear understanding of them. Footnote, this will be studied in the 4th volume of this book. End footnote. Consequently, what is said about the forms of worker consciousness can only be fragmentary. 1. Worker Party members. Firstly, here are some figures for the evolution of the Worker Party members. These figures show that two clear periods must be distinguished from each other. First, 1928 to 32, then the period from 1932 to the war. During the first period of the number of workers who were party members grew strongly, from 572,000 in 1928 to more than 1.5 million in 1932, parenthesis, end of December, end parenthesis. Footnote, figures calculated from T.H. Rigby, Communist Party membership in the USSR, 1917 to 1967, published in 1968. And footnote, this growth was faster than that of the total workers. It corresponded to a systematic policy of the party leadership that sought to increase the proportion of cadres of worker origin, regarding the latter as more, quote, reliable, end quote. The scope of this increase of the worker party members can only be appreciated if account is taken of both the policy that the party was putting into operation, parenthesis, and it is known that this manifested itself by anti-worker offensives that deeply lowered the working and living conditions of the workers, end parenthesis, into the motivations and attitudes of the workers who then belonged to the party. The greater part of the information that is available about the worker recruits of the party at the beginning of the 1930s, parenthesis, and this information comes as much from the Soviet press, which took up the complaints and requests of simple workers, as from the descriptions originating from workers and left-wing foreigners who worked in the USSR at this period, end parenthesis, suggesting that the recent worker members of the party were increasingly inclined, as soon as they had received a promotion, to consider themselves, quote, above, end quote, ordinary workers, and to assert themselves as a, quote, elite, end quote, with a right to a certain number of privileges. Footnote. Obviously, this kind of behavior was not new. It appeared from 1918 onwards. It was often, quote, condemned, end quote, by the Hard Party leadership, but this did not prevent its continuation. At the beginning of the 1930s, it became worse, because the privileges enjoyed by party members increased, and these became especially visible after 1931, when, quote, egalitarianism, end quote, was officially condemned. End footnote. The rift between ordinary workers and party members of worker origin, because of this, tended to deepen. This tendency was all the stronger in that the scale of the industrialization program and collectivization, and the development of the tasks of management, administration, and organization that this program implied, impelled the party leadership to transform rapidly a large proportion of its new worker recruits into officials and administrators. The behavior of new party members of working class origin, promoted to responsible posts, parenthesis, but also that of older party members, end parenthesis, was a source of real tension between the population and numerous cadres. These tensions impelled the party leadership to launch the purges of 1933 and 1934. These purges were accompanied by press campaigns from which it seems that most of those expelled in these years were accused of being, quote, careerists, end quote, quote, bureaucratic elements seeking personal advantage, end quote, quote, morally corrupt, end quote, quote, passive, end quote, and so on. Footnote. Other information on these points can be found in M. Wirt's Et Communiste, especially pages 13 and 207, and footnote. Without taking all these charges at face value, one can still acknowledge that they roughly reflect reality. Footnote. The real political motives for expulsion, bracket, that is, expulsion for deviations from the leadership's political line, end bracket, became important especially from 1935. The political motivations were then not generally disguised. End footnote. Among the direct testimony that is available about the new adherents and sympathizers of the party at the beginning of the 1930s is that of Seeliger. The general tone of Seeliger's writings, parenthesis, and the cross-checks that are possible, in parenthesis, make it hard to doubt the authenticity of this account. In his book, published for the first time in 1938 and republished twice since, this old member of the Yugoslav Politburo tells of his experience with the young militants of Leningrad, whom, up to May 1930, Seeliger was charged with instructing. This instruction was given to three categories of young militants, usually originating from the ranks of the workers. A first category was that of students of the Communist University. Seeliger writes that at first they seemed to form, quote, in some way the Leningrad proletarian elite, end quote. They were 25 to 30 years old, and he described them as, quote, healthy and energetic, end quote, adding, quote, they were nearly all working men and had long careers of public activity behind them, end quote. Footnote. This implies that these members had already been, quote, active sympathizers, end quote. End footnote. Seeliger emphasized their capacity to learn, but notes at the same time what might be termed an attitude of passive scholarship. Quote, they certainly learned very well all they were taught. They learned it too well. For them, what was not written in the manual did not exist, end quote. Seeliger. They were limited to the official program and showed no, quote, critical sense, end quote. When Seliger spoke to them about the role of the, quote, free activity of the masses, end quote, they remained indifferent. In their eyes, quote, it was the part of leaders to make decisions, end quote. On the material level, they enjoyed real privileges in a period of rigorous shortages, during which worker families were short of bread, milk, and butter, but their privileges and the suffering of the workers did not seem to embarrass them. When one spoke to them about it, they replied with generalities like, quote, the building up of socialism is not without its difficulties, end quote. Thus, in the end, knowing them better, Seliger no longer regards them as, quote, as a, quote, workers' elite, but as, quote, parvenus, end quote, anxious above all to defend their privileges. And if you don't know what a parvenu is, it's like a young, ambitious up-and-comer who is kind of like of obscure origin. About the second category of these students, those of the regional party school, Seliger does not say very much. Seliger indicates that they were young communists from the provinces, usually of peasant origin. They acknowledge the contradictions in which they found themselves, adhering to the political line of the party, but sharing the, quote, peasants' uneasiness, end quote, Seliger. Of these contradictory aspects, it was the first which triumphed, for these militants also were ready to be nothing more than low-level executants of a line determined by others. The last group of Seliger students comprised factory communist militants, members of the agitation and propaganda departments of enterprise cells in Leningrad, or secretaries of these cells. Nearly all were or had been workers. A third already occupied minor official positions. Others, while continuing with their manual labor, filled unpaid offices and were candidates for official positions. This was one of those channels by which the politically active left the ranks of the workers to enter official careers. Seliger indicates that the living conditions vouchsafed these pupils, who followed courses of 3 to 6 months, were excellent and privileged compared to workers who remained in the factories. All the same, unlike the pupils of the other categories, they remained close to the preoccupations of the working masses. They would speak about them while avoiding the commonplace explanations. They did not hesitate to declare, quote, the worker's life is unbearable, his patience is at an end, our propaganda meets with great obstacles among the workers, end quote. Seliger. Unlike the other students, these also showed a great interest in the revolutionary worker movements of other countries, in which they still placed a good deal of hope. Through these several observations can be seen the outline of several new types of new cadres and party members, some already gripped by anxieties about their own careers, others anxious about the situation of the workers, but relatively passive, and the last category closer to the working masses, whose discontent and hopes they expressed while partly turning toward the international revolutionary movement. The scale of the 1933 to 34 purges suggests that the mass entry of these types of cadre originating in the factories did not help party activity among the workers of factories at construction sites. For the period which begins after 1932, there is no less information about the party's worker recruitment. Nevertheless, it is known that in 1939 to 1940, it provided less than 20% of new members. In 1939, it would seem that workers formed only about 30% of the membership. They numbered about 700,000, a decrease of more than 50% since 1932. Even more important was that a percentage of party worker members represented no more than the equivalent of 5 to 6% of the total factory and construction site workers, against 19% in 1928 and 14.6% in 1932. These figures demonstrate the depth of the rift separating the party from the working masses. These figures confirm that the party's official ideology, exculpatory and triumphalist, was foreign to the forms of consciousness of the working masses. New section 2. The non-party workers. While it is difficult to comprehend the forms of consciousness, motivations, and aspirations of worker party members, it is even more difficult to investigate the same topics in relation to the non-party members. In fact, the open expression of the latter's feelings were strongly repressed, while on the other hand these feelings were extremely mixed and contradictory. The bits of knowledge that we have suggest that there coexisted within these masses deep discontent, parenthesis, to which we shall allude later, in parenthesis, and a kind of mass adhesion to the existing order. Most often, this discontent was not aimed at the regime, but at what were regarded as the, quote, abuses and, quote, shortcomings of the regime's operations, abuses and shortcomings which were regarded as remediable. Among the pieces of knowledge available, a special place may be granted to an investigation carried out between September 1950 and September 1951 among several thousand Soviet refugees in West Germany and the United States. Footnote. This investigation was in response to a, quote, order, end quote, of the U.S. government. It was intended mainly for federal administration officials, such as military leaders, more than for a reading, quote, public, end quote. It aimed to give a certain knowledge of the ideological and political conditions which existed in the USSR in the late 1930s and early 1940s. It was basically compiled with the help of former Soviet prisoners of war and deportees who did not return to the USSR after the war. Despite the very particular circumstances in which it was done, this inquiry seems to be reliable, for its results checked out well with the knowledge obtained elsewhere on the matters investigated. There is a report of this work by R.A. Bauer, Alex Inkelis, and Clyde Klukon, titled How the Soviet System Works, published in 1964. End footnote. Parenthesis, the conclusions of this do not seem to conform to what those who financed this project would have wished to, quote, reveal, end quote, in parenthesis. In fact, one of the conclusions the authors of this inquiry arrived at was the majority of workers accepted the existing social and economic situation. The authors observed that the workers who were interviewed did not usually question what is termed, quote, the institutional aspects of the Soviet system, such as government ownership of industry, end quote. The authors also note, quote, the Soviet worker appears to take the Soviet factory and its special form of organization for granted as the natural way of doing things. The Soviet worker is unhappy about the low pay. The Soviet worker wants the harsh labor laws eased or eliminated. The Soviet worker would like the pace eased and would be happy to have better materials to work with, but the Soviet worker questions hardly a single major aspect of the general organization of the Soviet factory system. End quote. However, this, quote, acceptance, end quote, of the existing order was combined with discontent, whose causes went far beyond those recalled in the above quotation. There were many reasons for discontent. In the first place, it is known that at the end of the 1930s, about 2/3 of the Soviet workers were, quote, new proletarians, end quote, snatched from the village by the brutal methods of collectivization and the claimed, quote, dekulakization, end quote. The great majority of these workers were placed in a miserable situation in consequence of party policy, and their situation was more painful than the one they had known previously, especially from the point of view of accommodation, food, and dependence on a hierarchy. This was extremely important, even if it was lived through by some as though it were some kind of, quote, natural catastrophe, end quote. It nevertheless provoked a discontent much deeper than that caused by one or another particular, quote, abuse, end quote. At the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, the deracination of large masses apparently gave rise to a rebirth of religious practices. This rebirth was felt by the party as a manifestation of opposition and was repressed as such. This happened above all in the smaller towns at the beginning of the first 5-year plan. For example, in May 1929, an OGPU report noted that whilst the workers of a locality near Smolensk were largely absent from May 1st holiday celebrations, they openly participated in large numbers at the religious ceremonies accompanying Easter. This report quotes the words of a young worker who declared, quote, "The Bolsheviks spite the workers, so the workers spite the Bolsheviks. Take their May Day holiday. The little children came out to hear the music, but all the workers stayed at home. But on their own Easter holiday, they all went to church. The Bolsheviks do evil to the workers, so the workers do them evil," unquote. Smolensk Archive, quoted by M. Fainsod in Smolensk, the book, page 308. And footnote. In the following years, this sort of oppositional manifestation seemed to have been less frequent. Religious practices then no longer appeared as a challenge. Rather, religious practices were a sign of allegiance to an ideology, other than that of the party, an ideology in which part of the workers sought to, quote, forget, unquote, the difficulties of daily life. It is not possible to evaluate the degree of influence of religious ideas within the working class. In any case, it seemed sufficiently worrying to the authorities to persuade the latter to launch several anti-religious campaigns, notably in 1936. Conversely, at the time of the war, the influence of religion, parenthesis, which actually was stronger among peasants than workers, end parenthesis, seemed so strong that the party ceased to attack it and contrived non-hostile relations with part of the clergy. Thus, the circumstances in which the large worker strata were formed weighed heavily on their forms of consciousness. All the more durable because the, quote, new proletarians, end quote, were most often the ones who had the most difficult life. Usually, the new proletarians received the lowest wages because, having no qualifications, these new proletarians provided the great majority of laborers. These new proletarians were the most poorly housed, most often in barracks, and in general, these new proletarians were immersed in work surroundings where powerful coercion held sway, which had nothing in common with the surroundings they had known previously. In fact, the difference of origin, town or country, and the differences of remuneration converged and mutually reinforced each other, marking out various cleavages within the working masses. The inquiry by R.A. Bauer and his associate, already quoted, confirms the depth of one of these cleavages. The authors of this investigation write, for example, quote, "It is important to recognize that the Soviet policy of marked differentials in pay and other rewards according to skill and productivity has apparently succeeded in introducing marked distinctions within the working class. The segment of the working class which separates itself under the self-designation, quote, skilled worker, end quote, is much more satisfied with its job experience in general and with its pay in particular than is the rank-and-file worker group," end quote. These same authors specify that from certain points of view, the skilled workers were closer to the non-manual workers than they were to the other workers, parenthesis, laborers and peasants, end parenthesis, although they identified themselves as belonging to the working class. They also note that their relationships with other workers seemed to be tarnished by antagonisms, especially when they served as an instrument for the revision of norms. However, what was most characteristic of the forms of consciousness of the working masses was the way in which the laborers and near unskilled workers, parenthesis, who represented the great majority of the mining and construction industry, in parenthesis, quote, endured, end quote, their implantation in production. The available information suggests from numerous indicators the existence of a critical, parenthesis, and sometimes hostile, in parenthesis, attitude not toward the, quote, system, end quote, which as has been seen was, quote, accepted as an abstraction, end quote, but of its concrete operation. These indications were to be found as much at the level of individual or collective attitudes as at the level of verbal expression. Most aspects of behavior which revealed a critical attitude toward the operation of the system have already been mentioned. To recapitulate, they were resistance to norm increases, indifference to output quality, absenteeism, etc. It has been seen how the authorities reacted to these attitudes and how they strove to divide the workers by developing a complex system of bonuses and personal, quote, incentives. It should be added that the authorities used another means to, quote, help the workers to endure the miserable existence that was their lot. This means was alcoholism. It is a fact that millions of Soviet workers drowned their sorrows in drink. It is also a fact that while so many other products were unobtainable, the state shops were never short of alcohol. The effects of this alcoholism were disastrous from the point of view of health and also of production, but nothing was done, parenthesis, and this is an understatement, in parenthesis, to combat alcoholism, because alcoholism constituted a, quote, political insurance, end quote, a means of atomizing the workers to increase the workers' social and political passivity. It was the opium of the Soviet people. True, the increase of alcohol consumption was not enough to obstruct various explosions of radical and deep discontent. These explosions, parenthesis, relatively rare because of the severity of repression and police vigilance, end parenthesis, manifested themselves as voluntary and collective work stoppages and street demonstrations. Because of the tight censorship, little is known about these worker struggles, but it is known that they broke out from time to time in forms that may be called, quote, spontaneous, end quote, by reason of the absence of stable workers' organizations. These struggles unfolded mainly in the industries in which the wages were lowest, parenthesis, like the textile industry, in parenthesis, or in towns that were especially badly supplied with food. During the first 5-year plan, it is known, for example, that there were strikes, demonstrations, and, quote, hunger marches, end quote, in various textile factories in Ivanovo, Voznesensk, Vychuga, and elsewhere, and that these worker struggles gave rise to severe repression. Footnote. On this and the following point, see Anton Seliga, The Soviet Enigma. End footnote. The unfolding of the repression and the way in which the workers reacted are very significant. In general, the authorities began by satisfying the essential demands, parenthesis, to diffuse the movement and ensure a return to work, end parenthesis. Then they exiled 2 or 3 workers and sent 10 or 20 to camps. Later in the following months, arrest of workers continued under various pretexts, parenthesis, for, quote, individual crimes, end quote, and parenthesis, so much so that thousands of workers were deported in the end. Seliga, who provides information about these struggles and the repression that they provoked, also notes about the participants in these struggles that in no way did they put themselves up as champions of a political cause, still less as adversaries of the regime. They took part for concrete and specific reasons and, once sentenced, they wished above all to re-enter society, such as it was, find work, and earn their release. These workers did not therefore appear to be, quote, opposers, end quote, of the regime. The complexity of the forms of consciousness of the workers also appeared, as noted above, at the level of verbal expression, but the latter could not be known until later, and only in particular circumstances which occurred especially in the second half of the 1930s. Then the party leadership itself decided to make room for the expression of worker discontent, while taking care to see that worker discontent was directed towards local level bosses in industry, and more exceptionally in the party. Following decisions taken after 1935, numerous complaints flooded the newspapers and certain official departments, notably those of the judiciary, from 1936 to 1938. Footnote. These decisions aimed to impose more, quote, discipline on economic managers and local and regional cadres. For this, the party leadership sought to rely on the public, asking the public to, quote, unmask faulty cadres, end quote. The main decisions then adopted were the following: a resolution of June 1935 condemning the negligence with which requests and complaints from the public were treated; a directive of the Supreme Court which prohibited the divulgence of the names of people supplying compromising information; a decision of March 1936 that obliged newspaper editors to publish the, quote, politically most important, end quote, letters, and to study what such letters meant, etc. In fact, several measures were taken at this time in the same direction, and numerous articles aimed at encouraging the bringing to light of bad work of civic institutions and enterprises. A perusal of newspapers of the time, and of those archives to which access is possible, in practice this means essentially the Smolensk archives, now in the United States, enables a certain view to be taken of the picture made of the situation by the different worker strata, the judgments that they made on it, and the changes they wished to make in it. Nevertheless, information obtained in this way is necessarily limited. Firstly, it was only a minority which complained by addressing itself to the authorities. Secondly, those who complained apparently, quote, censored, end quote, the expression of their recriminations, because previous experience had shown that excessively pointed complaints could rebound onto the heads of their authors, with the authorities declaring, quote, these complaints are from the enemy, end quote. Footnote. Thus, on a letter of complaint may be read the following note, quote, the enemy's method of discrediting the administration, end quote. This note is apparently written by the addressee of the letter himself. End footnote. In these circumstances, what was condemned in letters from the population corresponded above all, but not exclusively, to what was condemnable by official ideology. Despite these limitations, an examination of the complaints coming from the public is still very instructive. If one takes to begin with the dossier of complaints in the Smolensk archives, it would appear that the authors of the letters emphasized that all the, quote, abuses, end quote, which were being produced in the economic and social system as it was, and that these abuses to them seemed to come essentially from the objective circumstances of the system's operation, parenthesis, from the social relationships and practices that were objectively dominant, end parenthesis, but from subjective personal characteristics of one or another agent of the system. Thus the workers who wrote these letters ascribed their difficult or intolerable situation to the cadres connected with them and to the cadres' indifference. They complained of definite individuals who were exercising managerial functions and who were criticized for administrative arbitrariness, brutality, behaving like, quote, potentates, or, quote, great lords, end quote, corruption, etc. As Rittersporn remarks, these missives were written in the, quote, official style, end quote. The authors ostensibly used the arguments used by the press and spokesman. I think in in some of the mainstream of Sovietology, they refer to this as like speaking Bolshevik, like addressing, like using like the language of the regime to talk to the regime. Anyway, as Richard Sporn remarks, these missives were written in the, quote, official style, end quote. The authors ostentatiously used the arguments used by the press and official spokesmen. The authors affected proclaimed principles in order to protest against their infringement. On the whole, they did not put into explicit question the economic and social system or the principles by which wages and norms were fixed. This type of letter did not usually contest the way the managers they condemned were appointed, nor the circumstances in which these managers were chosen. The authors complained only of, quote, concrete facts, end quote. Wages that were too low, managers who were brutal or corrupt, etc. The perusal of such complaints obviously does not tell us whether those expressing them limited themselves voluntarily to condemning mainly those acts which official propaganda had designated as condemnable. And whether the authors of letters sent to the authorities actually believed they had only complaints to make about facts that were, quote, isolated or, quote, particular, end quote, parenthesis, even though the same facts were widespread throughout the country, end parenthesis. The almost total absence of complaints going beyond the immediate situation, while repression was developing on a larger scale, invites the thought that there was an extreme prudence towards the authorities. Those who addressed themselves to them did so in despair, in face of situations felt to be intolerable. The style of these complaints therefore reflected more distrust than confidence toward the party organizations, press, or judiciary, which were meant to take notice of them. This appeared when the authors of these complaints threatened to carry them, if a favorable outcome failed to appear, to a higher level, to appeal to Moscow or Stalin. However, such a threat suggests that the authors of these complaints had perhaps a little faith in the higher levels. This faith, if it was genuine, and it seems that part of it was nurtured by the repression that the higher leadership was exercising at this time against the local and intermediate cadres. The latter were often hated, and the repression that struck them was felt to conform to popular sentiment. Fear of being punished for making a complaint impelled some writers of letters to refer to a much wider discontent which they said was felt by workers who did not dare to protest by letter. These writers held the authorities themselves to blame. For example, the authors of a letter denouncing the behavior, parenthesis, described as stupid, in parenthesis, of certain managers declared, quote, "We are writing ... because all the ignorant and conscienceless workers are slandering the authorities because of such idiots," end quote. Quoted by Richard Sporn. Footnote: this suggests the existence of a discontent much more radical than that expressed by the authors of the letters personally. End footnote. This suggests the existence of a discontent much more radical than that personally expressed by the authors of the letters. The discussion campaign mounted in 1936 around the project of the new Constitution, parenthesis, which was adopted at the end of the year, in parenthesis, was also an opportunity for a certain number of workers to express their point of view and their criticisms, but information about the criticisms expressed in the framework of these discussions is relatively rare. However, it does suggest that at times the discussion was carried further than the authorities wished. For example, while certain officials were blamed for having reduced the discussion to a mere, quote, formality, end quote, others were attacked for, quote, not having been able to lead the criticism, end quote, which meant that questions were raised whose discussion did not seem desirable to the authorities. The Smolensk archives reveal some of the themes raised against the wishes of the authorities. Among them figure changes to be made in labor legislation. For example, workers wanted to see in the Constitution the obligation of enterprise managers to respect this legislation. Suggestions were also made with a view to a more strict regulation concerning dismissals, work safety, and the extension of free medical services. Workers demanded a better guarantee of their personal safety or a change in the way officials and especially judges were appointed. Some demanded that officials should be elected. Some workers suggested that opposition parties should be legalized. All this indicates the existence of an ideology quite different from the official ideology. The available information enables us to know only very little about the ideological differentiations existing between workers, and about the discussions which resulted from this. However, we know that discussions took place, and that points of view that differed from the official point of view succeeded in getting themselves expressed. We also have that when these diverging points of view obtained sufficient support, they sometimes got mentioned in the press. Footnote. This is especially the case in different numbers of Pravda in July 1936 and the columns devoted to discussions of the draft constitution. End footnote. Nevertheless, the active participants in the discussion were a minority, the majority of workers staying aloof, participating in only a formal sense when meetings were organized at which attendance was practically unavoidable. In sum, everything indicates that there were shattered forms of worker consciousness. These forms coincided very rarely with the justificatory and triumphalist discourse of the authorities, for the authorities had scarcely any relationship with the great difficulties in which the public was floundering. These forms of shattered worker consciousness favored the more or less passive acceptance of the situation, but did not block the expression of much recrimination or even the explosion of open but local demonstrations of discontent. Two elements contributed at the time to prevent this discontent taking an organized, explosive form. The first, perceptible, especially in the second half of the 1930s, was the ability of the authorities to themselves talk about the situation and denounce the circumstances that especially exasperated the workers. Hence the numerous interventions of Stalin, pillaring the, quote, bureaucracy, the attitudes of, quote, great lords, and of certain managers, and the, quote, scandalous attitude towards people, cadres, and workers, end quote. Footnote. See, for example, the speech by Stalin on May 4th, 1935 in his collected works. End footnote. Such words obscure the role played by the authorities themselves in the consolidation of a system that multiplied the privileges and the arrogance of an exploiting managing minority. However, through the denunciation which it included, this discourse sounded in the ears of the workers like an echo of their own complaints. It contributed above all, when repression fell on part of the cadres, in developing a populist feeling with a certain faith in the power summit from which this discourse came. Thus there coexisted in the worker consciousness an absence of adhesion to the official ideology, a multiform discontent with the functioning of the system, together with a, quote, faith, end quote, of the populist type in the top leadership of the party. Thus, there existed in the worker consciousness an absence of adhesion to the official ideology, a multiform discontent with the functioning of the system, together with a, quote, faith of the populist type in the top leadership of the party. The second element which prevented accumulated discontent taking on explosive form was the scale itself of the repression. The repression succeeded in dismantling any attempt at organized resistance. It gave rise to, quote, prudence, unquote, fear, and the passive acceptance of things as they were. Above all, since it generated a vast sector of penal work, it made those who were not subjected to that kind of work feel that they were, quote, privileged, end quote. That's the end of this section, which again is the fifth section of chapter 2 of part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, the third period, 1930 to 1941, the dominated. In chapter 2, section 2, part 2 of the book was titled The Militarized Working Class, and chapter 2 of part 2 was titled Extension of the Wage Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. And this video has been the second video of part 5 of chapter 2, which was titled The Circumstances of the Workers' Defeat of the 1930s. Thank you so much for listening.